Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On March 31st, 1913, in a suite at the Grand Hotel in Rome, a man lay dying who had held more financial power than most governments. John Pierpont Morgan, 75 years old, his massive frame diminished by illness, his legendary energy finally spent, drifted in and out of consciousness, while the spring sun filtered through tall windows overlooking the eternal city. His daughter Louisa sat beside the bed. His son Jack, known throughout the financial world as J.P. Morgan Jr., had rushed across the Atlantic but arrived too late. The doctors had tried everything their medical knowledge offered, but the old man's constitution, weakened by decades of stress and a lifetime of indulgence, had reached its limit. Years of cigars, rich food, transatlantic crossings, and the constant pressure of controlling billions had taken their toll. Morgan had come to Rome seeking rest and cultural enrichment, the twin passions that had always offered him relief from the relentless demands of finance. He had spent the winter months visiting museums, attending art auctions, examining manuscripts, and purchasing treasures for his vast collection. Just weeks earlier, he had been vigorously bargaining with dealers, examining artifacts with the same penetrating gaze he turned on corporate balance sheets. Now he could barely speak. The room was silent except for his laboured breathing. Outside, the ancient city continued its rhythms, unaware that within the Grand Hotel one of the most powerful men of the modern age was slipping away. Morgan had bailed out the United States Treasury. He had organised industrial combinations that created companies employing hundreds of thousands. He had personally prevented financial panics through sheer force of will. He had decided which railroads would survive and which would fail. Presidents had sought his counsel. European monarchs had borrowed from his banks. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, John Pierpont, Morgan took his final breath. A massive blood clot, the result of weeks of deteriorating circulation, had finally stopped his heart. The financier who had saved the American economy multiple times, who had built an empire spanning continents, who had accumulated art treasures rivaling royal collections, was dead. The news flashed across the Atlantic via telegraph. In New York, the stock market convulsed. Morgan's death was front-page news from London to San Francisco. Flags flew at half-mast. Banks closed their doors in tribute. The New York Stock Exchange suspended trading. It was as if a monarch had fallen. Consider the strangeness of what I've just described. Here was a man born into comfortable circumstances, but not extraordinary wealth. He suffered from chronic skin disease that disfigured his face and made him the subject of cruel mockery. He had no revolutionary insights into business or economics. He invented nothing. He discovered no new territories. He wrote no books of philosophy or great literature. He held no elected office. Yet he became the most powerful private citizen in America. He controlled more wealth than the federal government. A single word from him could trigger financial collapse or prevent it. When the entire banking system of the United States teetered on the edge of ruin in 1907, it was not the President or Congress who saved it, but J.P. Morgan, working through the night in his private library, commanding bankers and trust company presidents like a general deploying troops. How does this happen? How does one man, in a democracy, in an age of supposed equality, concentrate such tremendous power in his hands? And what does it mean that the nation's financial system depended not on laws or institutions, but on the personal authority of a single private banker? Tonight we will trace the remarkable life of J.P. Morgan from his birth in Hartford, Connecticut, to his death in Rome. We will walk through the Gilded Age that shaped him and that he helped create. We will examine the deals that built industrial America, the panics he prevented and caused, and the empire he constructed that would outlive him by generations. This is the story of money and power in their purest forms, concentrated in the hands of a man who believed he had a duty to use them. Before we begin this journey into America's Gilded Age, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and tell me. And now, let us travel back to the Hartford of 1837, to the world into which the future Napoleon of Wall Street was born. To understand J.P. Morgan, we must first understand the Hartford, Connecticut of the 1830s and 1840s, a city that represented everything the young American Republic aspired to become. Hartford was not New York or Boston, not yet among the first rank of American cities, but it was prosperous, respectable, and deeply committed to the twin engines that would build the American century: commerce and moral improvement. The city sat on the Connecticut River, that ancient highway of trade that had carried goods and people since before European settlement. The river connected Hartford to the Atlantic, to New York, to the wider world of commerce. By the 1830s, steamboats churned up and down its length. Warehouses lined the docks. The city had become a centre of insurance, that peculiarly American innovation that turned risk itself into a commodity that could be bought and sold. Insurance companies proliferated in Hartford, selling policies that protected merchants from fire, shipwreck, and bankruptcy. The business required careful calculation, conservative management, and absolute trustworthiness. The men who succeeded in insurance developed reputations for probity and sound judgment. They learned to evaluate risk, to read balance sheets, to distinguish solid ventures from speculative bubbles. These were the skills that would define American finance for the next century. The city's prosperity was visible everywhere. Solid brick buildings lined the commercial streets. Churches with tall white steeples dominated the skyline, testaments to the Protestant Christianity that provided both the spiritual foundation and the business ethic of the community. The houses of the successful merchants were substantial but not ostentatious, displaying prosperity without vulgarity. This was New England at its height, confident in its values, certain of its rectitude. Into this world of measured prosperity, John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837. His full name reflected the family's sense of its own importance. John came from his paternal grandfather, a hotel keeper who had risen to modest prominence. Pierpont came from his maternal grandfather, Reverend John Pierpont, a Unitarian minister, poet, and social reformer whose name carried real distinction in New England circles. The Morgans were not old money by Boston standards, but they were solidly established. Pierpont's father, Junior Spencer Morgan, was building a successful career in the mercantile trade, dealing in the commodities that flowed through Hartford's warehouses: coffee, spices, dry goods. Junius was a man of sober habits and serious ambition. He dressed conservatively, spoke carefully, and applied himself to business with methodical discipline. He was not brilliant, but he was reliable, and in the world of commerce, reliability was worth more than flashes of genius. Pierpont's mother, Juliet, was the daughter of the Reverend Pierpont, and she brought to the marriage a sense of moral and intellectual elevation that the Morgan family lacked. Her father was well known in New England as a preacher who combined traditional Unitarian theology with progressive politics. He spoke against slavery, supported education reform, and wrote poetry that was widely published. Through his mother's family, young Pierpont absorbed the sense that wealth should serve higher purposes, that success brought obligations, that those born to advantage had duties to discharge. The Hartford of Pierpont's childhood was a city transformed by change. The Erie Canal had opened in 1825, fundamentally reshaping American commerce. The railroads were beginning their inexorable spread across the landscape. The textile mills of New England were humming with activity. powered by water wheels and filled with the labour of young women drawn from the farms. America in the 1830s and 1840s was discovering its economic potential, and the energy was intoxicating. But this was also an age of terrible instability. The American economy lurched from boom to bust with terrifying regularity. The Panic of 1837, the year of Pierpont's birth, had triggered a depression that lasted 6 years. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. The hard money doctrines of President Andrew Jackson had contributed to the disaster, and the lesson was not lost on the young merchants and bankers of Hartford. Financial stability required careful management, conservative practices, and institutions that could withstand shocks. Young Pierpont grew up in a household where these events were discussed at the dinner table. His father tracked the movements of markets, evaluated the soundness of various enterprises, and absorbed the lessons of each financial crisis. The boy learned early that money was not simply something one earned and spent, but a force that had to be understood, managed, controlled. Mismanage money and you lost everything. Master it and you could build empires. The family lived comfortably but not extravagantly. The house was substantial, located in a good neighbourhood, staffed by servants, but without pretension to luxury. Junius believed in living within one's means, in building capital, in planning for the future. These were not the habits of gamblers or speculators, but of merchants who expected to pass their businesses to their sons, who thought in terms of generations rather than quarterly returns. And there were expectations for young Pierpont. He was the eldest son, the one who would inherit not just property, but the responsibility of maintaining and expanding the family's position. From his earliest years, he understood that much was expected of him. The weight of those expectations would shape his entire life. Pierpont was a serious child, perhaps too serious. He had his mother's intensity and his father's discipline without much capacity for lightness or play. He applied himself to his studies with grim determination. He learned his lessons, mastered his sums, and prepared himself for whatever examinations life would present. But he was not precocious, not a child prodigy who astonished adults with unexpected brilliance. He was simply competent, steady, and determined to meet expectations. Household revolved around work, education, and worship. The Morgan family attended church regularly, absorbed the sermons, and attempted to live according to Christian principles as they understood them. For Pierpont's grandfather, the Reverend Pierpont, Christianity meant social reform, abolition of slavery, and moral improvement of society. For his father Junius, Christianity meant honesty in business dealings, care for family and personal discipline. These were different emphases, but both agreed that wealth and faith were compatible, even complementary. God smiled on industry. Success was evidence of virtue. Yet Pierpont carried with him from childhood something that would mark him forever, a condition that would shape his personality, influence his relationships, and remain a source of private anguish throughout his life. He suffered from acne rosacea, a chronic skin condition that caused inflammation, redness, and eventually disfiguring lumps on his face, particularly his nose. The condition began mildly in childhood, but worsened as he aged. By his adult years, his nose would become grotesquely swollen and discoloured, covered with raised purple blotches. Photographs from his later life show a face dominated by this deformity, a nose so enlarged and misshapen that it was impossible not to notice. In an age when physical appearance was read as evidence of character, when phrenology claimed to discern moral qualities from facial features, this visible condition was a source of shame and vulnerability. Children can be cruel. There is no record of what young Pierpont endured from his peers, but we can imagine the taunts, the stares, the sense of being different in a way that could not be hidden or corrected. He learned early to armour himself against mockery, to project an intimidating presence that would discourage familiarity. The imperious manner, the cold stare, the volcanic temper that would later terrify associates and subordinates. All of these perhaps had their roots in a child's need to defend himself against the judgment of others. But childhood was brief. By the time Pierpont was in his early teens, his father had made a decision that would change the trajectory of the family's fortunes and set young Pierpont on the path to unimaginable wealth and power. In 1851, Junius Spencer Morgan made the most important business decision of his life. He accepted an offer to become a partner in a London banking house, George Peabody and Company. It meant leaving Hartford, leaving America, and relocating the family to England. For Junius, now in his late 30s, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. For 14-year-old Pierpont, it meant being uprooted from the only world he had known and transplanted into the heart of global finance. London in the 1850s was the undisputed financial capital of the world. The British Empire was at its apex, controlling territory across every inhabited continent. British manufacturers dominated global trade. British ships carried goods across the oceans, and British banks financed it all, extending credit to nations and corporations, managing the complex web of international commerce that made 19th century globalization possible. George Peabody was an American who had built a successful banking operation in London, serving as an intermediary between British capital and American investment opportunities. Britain had money to lend. America had railroads to build, canals to dig, factories to establish. Peabody's firm made the connection, earning fees and commissions on the capital that flowed across the Atlantic. Junius Morgan joined the firm as a junior partner and quickly impressed Peabody with his diligence and judgment. Within a few years, Peabody began contemplating retirement, and Junius positioned himself as the natural successor. The firm would eventually become J.S. Morgan and Company, one of the most prestigious merchant banks in London, and Junius would spend the rest of his career there, growing wealthy and respected as a pillar of the Anglo-American financial community. For young Pierpont, the move to London meant an education fundamentally different from what he would have received in Hartford. He was enrolled in a series of schools in England, Switzerland, and Germany, receiving the cosmopolitan education that wealthy Americans increasingly sought for their sons. He learned French and German. He studied mathematics, history, and literature. He travelled through Europe, visiting museums, attending concerts, absorbing the culture of societies far older and more sophisticated than his native land. But it was in Göttingen, Germany, that Pierpont received the education that would define his career. He spent 2 years at the University of Göttingen studying mathematics. This was not mathematics as most people understand it, not arithmetic or simple geometry. This was higher mathematics, the kind that reveals patterns, that trains the mind to see relationships, that teaches systematic thinking. Mathematics teaches discipline. It demands precision. There is only one correct answer, and approximation is failure. For a young man learning to think about complex financial structures, about the relationships between currencies, interest rates, and risk, mathematics provided the foundation. Pierpont learned to break down complicated problems into manageable components, to calculate with accuracy, to verify his assumptions. More importantly, he learned confidence in his own analytical abilities. Mathematics is unforgiving but also objective. Either your proof works or it does not. Either your calculation is correct or it is wrong. For someone who would later make decisions involving millions of dollars based on his assessment of balance sheets and corporate structures, this intellectual training was invaluable. He was not, by all accounts, a particularly social creature. He did not make close friends easily. He was intensely private, uncomfortable with casual intimacy. His facial condition had grown worse, and he was acutely self-conscious about his appearance. He compensated with formality, with a stern demeanour that kept others at a distance. Those who knew him in these years described him as serious, studious, and somewhat aloof. These traits would intensify as he aged. By the time Pierpont returned to America in 1857, he was 20 years old, fluent in multiple languages, educated at prestigious European institutions, and connected through his father to one of London's most important banking houses. He had been groomed since childhood for a career in finance. All that remained was to begin. He started as a clerk in the New York office of Duncan, Sherman and Company, which served as the American correspondent of his father's London firm. The work was basic: copying letters, filing documents, running errands. But it taught him the mechanics of international banking, the daily routines that made the system function. He learned how bills of exchange worked, how commodities were financed, how credit flowed between institutions. The New York of the late 1850s was a city transformed by commerce. The harbour bristled with ships from every nation. The newly completed Erie Canal had made the city the gateway to the American interior. Goods flowed through its warehouses on their way from European factories to American consumers, from American farms to foreign markets. The city's population was exploding, swelled by waves of immigration, particularly Irish and German families fleeing poverty and political turmoil. Wall Street, where young Morgan worked, was not yet the canyon of skyscrapers it would become. The buildings were modest, 3 and 4 stories built of brick and stone, but already the street represented something powerful, the concentration of financial services that made New York America's commercial capital. Banks, insurance companies, stockbrokers, commodities, traders, all clustered in the few blocks around Wall Street and Broad Street. Morgan absorbed it all. He watched how experienced bankers evaluated risks. He learned to read balance sheets, to distinguish solid ventures from speculative bubbles. He observed the personal relationships that underpinned finance. A handshake between men who trusted each other could seal a deal worth thousands. A whispered rumour about a firm's solvency could trigger a run that destroyed it. Reputation was everything, and Morgan was learning how reputations were built and destroyed. His first independent deal came in 1859, when he was just 22. He was in New Orleans on business for Duncan, Sherman, when he encountered a ship captain with a cargo of coffee to sell. The captain needed to unload quickly and was willing to sell below market price. Morgan, on his own authority and using the firm's credit, bought the entire cargo. It was a gamble. If coffee prices fell before he could resell, the firm would suffer losses. But Morgan had studied the coffee market, understood the seasonal patterns of supply and demand, and calculated that prices would rise. They did. Morgan resold the coffee at a substantial profit. It was not a huge sum by the standards of what he would later command, but it was his first proof to himself and to others that he could make independent judgments about markets and make them correctly. The partners at Duncan, Sherman, were initially furious that a junior clerk had committed the firm's capital without authorization. But when they saw the results, their anger turned to grudging respect. This young man had instincts. More importantly, he was in New York at the beginning of what would be the most dynamic period in American economic history. The railroads were expanding explosively. In 1850, the United States had about 9,000 miles of track. By 1860, that had grown to over 30,000 miles. The Iron Horse was transforming American life, making it possible to move goods and people across distances that had once taken weeks in days. Towns sprang up along rail lines. Farmers could ship their crops to distant markets. manufacturers could distribute their products across the continent. But building railroads required capital on a scale that American wealth alone could not provide. A single major line might cost tens of millions of dollars. The money had to come from Europe, primarily from British investors who had accumulated enormous wealth during their Industrial Revolution and were looking for returns higher than what European securities offered. This created the opportunity for intermediaries, bankers who could connect British capital with American railroads, who could evaluate which rail ventures were sound and which were fraudulent, who could assure nervous European investors that their money would be safe. Fortunes were being made and lost. New industries were emerging. The country was on the verge of civil war, which would transform the economy in ways no one yet understood. And Pierpont Morgan, 20 years old, was positioned at the intersection of American opportunity and British capital, ready to make his fortune. But the path would not be smooth. There would be failures, setbacks, personal tragedies that would test him in ways his education had not prepared him for. Before he became the most powerful banker in America, Pierpont Morgan would have to learn lessons that could only be taught by loss. The Civil War transformed America, and it transformed Pierpont Morgan. When the war began in April 1861, he was 24 years old, working as a junior banker in New York, still building his reputation, still proving himself to his father and to the wider financial community. When the war ended in April 1865, he was a wealthy man, a partner in his own firm, and possessed of a ruthless understanding of how money could be made from national catastrophe. The early war years brought chaos to American finance. The federal government, desperate to fund the massive armies required to defeat the Confederacy, needed money on a scale unprecedented in American history. Traditional tax revenues were wholly inadequate. The government turned to bonds, to loans, to any financial mechanism that could raise capital. Banks and financial houses that could help the government borrow had the opportunity to make extraordinary profits. The scope of the financial challenge was staggering. At the start of the war, the federal government's annual budget was approximately $60 million. By war's end, it was spending that much every few weeks. The government needed to borrow hundreds of millions, eventually over $1 billion, to fund the armies that would fight from Virginia to Texas, from Pennsylvania to New Mexico. The national debt, which had been negligible before the war, would explode to levels that seemed incomprehensible. Northern banks and financial institutions stepped forward to help. They purchased government bonds, sold them to investors, arranged credit for war contractors, and managed the complex financial machinery that allowed the Union to outspend the Confederacy. The South, with its agricultural economy and limited banking infrastructure, could not compete financially. The war would ultimately be won not just on battlefields but in the bond markets and banking houses of New York, Philadelphia and Boston. Pierpont did not serve in the Union Army. Like many wealthy young men of his generation, he avoided military service. The draft law passed in 1863 allowed substitution. A man could pay another to serve in his place. The fee was typically $300, a sum far beyond what working-class families could afford. Morgan paid for a substitute, as did John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and countless others who would later shape American business. Some historians have suggested he suffered from health problems that would have disqualified him anyway. His chronic skin condition might have been deemed medically disqualifying, though there is no definitive documentation. What is certain is that Morgan, like many sons of wealthy families, used the substitution provision to avoid service while profiting from the war. The moral calculus of this decision troubled Morgan not at all, at least not publicly. He was a banker, not a soldier. His contribution to the Union cause would be financial, not military. This was how he rationalized his position, and the rationalization was widely accepted among his class. The war required different kinds of service. Some men fought, others provided the capital that made fighting possible. One of his early ventures during the war became notorious and would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1861, Morgan financed a deal to buy old defective rifles from a government arsenal for $3.50 each, then immediately resold them to a Union Army general for $22 each. The rifles were known as Hall carbines that had been condemned as dangerous. Some exploded when fired, injuring the soldiers who used them. The barrels were defective, the mechanisms unreliable. The transaction worked through intermediaries. Arthur Eastman purchased the rifles from the government, borrowed money from Morgan to complete the purchase, then sold them to General Fremont's forces in Missouri. Morgan's role was purely financial, providing the credit that made the transaction possible. But when the scandal came to light, when newspapers reported that soldiers were being issued weapons that could kill them as easily as kill the enemy, public outrage was fierce. Congressional investigations followed. The testimony revealed the details of the transaction. The government had sold defective weapons that it had already condemned. An intermediary had purchased them with borrowed money. Union troops in the field received them as new equipment. Some soldiers died or were maimed when the rifles exploded, and various parties, including Morgan, had profited from the entire chain of events. Morgan was not technically guilty of fraud. He had not personally inspected the rifles. He had not misrepresented their condition. He had simply provided financing for a transaction that passed through intermediaries. Legally, he was clear. Morally, the stain remained. Men were being killed in battle, and Morgan was profiting from selling defective weapons back to the very army that had discarded them as dangerous. It was the kind of sharp dealing that would characterize aspects of his entire career: legally defensible, morally dubious, and extremely profitable. The Hall carbine affair taught Morgan important lessons. First, legal compliance was not the same as ethical behaviour, though that distinction apparently did not trouble him. Second, and more practically, public opinion mattered in America in ways it did not in Europe. A banker could not simply enrich himself through questionable deals without consequences. Scandals damaged reputations, and reputation was the foundation of a banking career. Morgan became more careful after the carbine affair. He cultivated relationships with newspapers. He learned to present his activities in favourable light. He understood that in America, unlike in Europe, public legitimacy required more than simply being successful. It required appearing to serve the public interest, even when pursuing private profit. Through his father's connections in London, Morgan became involved in selling Union bonds to British investors. This was cleaner work, more respectable. The United States government needed to borrow hundreds of millions of dollars. British investors had capital to lend but were skeptical about American credit. Would the Union win the war? Could a divided America repay its debts? The Confederate government was issuing its own bonds, and some British investors, particularly those with ties to the cotton trade, favoured the South. Morgan and his father's firm J.S. Morgan and Company served as intermediaries, assuring British investors that Union bonds were safe, that the North would win, that repayment was certain. They earned commissions on each transaction, fees that added up as the borrowing continued year after year. This was respectable financial work, the kind of business that enhanced rather than damaged reputations. As the war progressed and Union victory became increasingly certain, these bonds appreciated in value. Those who had bought them early, when the war's outcome was uncertain and prices were depressed, made fortunes as prices rose toward par value. Morgan, who had inside knowledge from his network of financial contacts, positioned himself perfectly. He bought when prices were low during moments of Union military setbacks. He sold when they were high after Union victories. He accumulated capital at a remarkable rate for someone still in his 20s. The war also taught Morgan about the relationship between government and finance, lessons he would apply throughout his career. Governments needed private bankers to borrow on the scale modern warfare required. But governments also resented that dependence, resented paying fees to middlemen, resented the private profits made from national crisis. This tension between public need and private profit would define much of Morgan's later career, as he alternately worked with and battled against government authority. In 1861, in the midst of this financial activity, Morgan married Amelia Sturgis, known as Mimi. She was the daughter of a successful New York merchant, a lovely, cultured young woman who seemed to offer everything Morgan could want in a wife: beauty, social connections, refinement. The wedding was celebrated at her family home. The young couple moved into a house on New York's fashionable Fifth Avenue. The future looked promising. 4 months later, Mimi died of tuberculosis. The disease had probably been developing before the marriage. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, was a slow killer that could remain hidden for months or years before revealing itself. But once the symptoms appeared, the end was usually swift. Mimi wasted away through the winter of 1861-62. Morgan watched helplessly as his young wife coughed blood, grew skeletal, and finally stopped breathing. He never spoke publicly about his grief. There are no letters in which he poured out his sorrow, no journal entries recording his pain. But those who knew him said the loss changed him. The formality and emotional distance that had always characterized his manner hardened into something colder. He had loved Mimi, perhaps the only time in his early life that he allowed himself such vulnerability. Her death taught him that love was dangerous, that emotional attachment led to suffering. He threw himself into work with even greater intensity. Work did not betray you. Work did not die. Work was something you could control through intelligence and effort, and there was so much work to be done. By 1864, Morgan was ready to establish his own firm. He was 27 years old, wealthy from his wartime dealings, connected through his father to London capital, and confident in his abilities. He formed a partnership with Charles Dabney, creating the firm Dabney, Morgan and Company. The firm would buy and sell securities, arrange financing for businesses, and serve as New York correspondent for J.S. Morgan and Company in London. This was the foundation of what would become the Morgan Empire. Not yet the colossus that would dominate American finance, but a respectable firm with good connections and growing capital. Morgan was learning the business from the inside, making the mistakes that could only be made with one's own money at risk, developing the instincts that would later allow him to make instantaneous decisions involving millions. He also remarried, perhaps too quickly by the standards of the time. In 1865, he married Frances Louisa Tracy, known as Fanny. She was the daughter of a prominent lawyer, intelligent and capable, though not the society beauty that Mimi had been. The marriage was practical more than romantic, a union appropriate to Morgan's rising status. Fanny would give him 4 children and manage his household competently for 48 years. But theirs was not a marriage of great passion. Morgan would seek emotional connection and physical satisfaction elsewhere, in a series of discreet affairs that Fanny apparently accepted as the price of being Mrs. J.P. Morgan. As the war ended, and the nation began the chaotic process of reconstruction, Morgan stood poised to take advantage of the opportunities that peace would bring. The war had demonstrated the potential of American industry. It had forced the creation of new manufacturing capacity, new organizational structures, new financial mechanisms. The railroads had proven their strategic importance. Telegraph lines now connected the coasts. The groundwork had been laid for an industrial transformation that would make America the richest nation on earth. And Pierpont Morgan, still in his 20s, was positioned to finance that transformation and to extract his share of the wealth it would create. For the next 15 years, from 1865 to 1880, Pierpont Morgan worked methodically to establish himself among the elite of American finance. These were not the triumphant years that would come later. This was the grinding period of building reputation, accumulating capital, learning the business, and positioning himself for the opportunities that would make him truly powerful. He was successful, certainly, wealthy by most standards, but he was not yet dominant. He was not yet the Morgan who could command presidents and rescue the Treasury. That would come later. First, he had to master his trade. The work of a private banker in the Gilded Age was not what most people imagine. It did not involve trading stocks in frantic open outcry or making split-second decisions based on market movements. It was slower, more deliberate, built on relationships and inside knowledge rather than quick reflexes. A banker's most valuable asset was his reputation for soundness. If wealthy individuals and institutions trusted you with their capital, if they believed you would invest it prudently and return it with appropriate interest, then you had the raw material for building a financial empire. Morgan's firm, Dabney Morgan & Company, specialized in several areas. They dealt in foreign exchange, managing the complex transactions required when American merchants needed to pay British suppliers or when British investors wanted to buy American securities. They arranged bond issues for railroads and other corporations that needed to raise capital, and they provided commercial credit to businesses engaged in trade. The key to success in this business was information. Morgan needed to know which railroads were soundly managed and which were fraudulent schemes. He needed to understand which industries were growing and which were declining. He needed to evaluate the creditworthiness of businesses seeking loans. This required a network of contacts, relationships with other bankers who could provide intelligence, and the judgment to distinguish reliable information from speculation. Morgan cultivated these relationships systematically. He joined the right clubs. He attended the right social functions. He made himself useful to established figures in American finance, providing them with information from his father's London network in exchange for access to American deals. Slowly, methodically, he built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with important transactions. His father remained a crucial advantage. J.S. Morgan & Company in London was one of the most prestigious Anglo-American banking houses. British investors who wanted to put money into American ventures often sought Junius Morgan's advice. Junius would recommend opportunities to his son in New York. Pierpont would evaluate them, take a commission for arranging the financing, and report back to his father on how the investments performed. This transatlantic partnership gave both men advantages their competitors lacked. The railroads were central to everything. In the decades after the Civil War, America was building the most extensive railroad network in the world. By 1880, the United States had more than 93,000 miles of track. These railroads required enormous amounts of capital. Building a transcontinental line cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The money had to come from somewhere, and increasingly it came from European investors, particularly the British, who saw American railroads as offering better returns than European securities. But investing in American railroads was risky. The industry was plagued by fraud, mismanagement, and cutthroat competition. Promoters would claim to be building lines that existed only on paper. Companies would engage in rate wars that bankrupted them. Executives would loot their own corporations. British investors who bought railroad bonds based on glowing prospectuses often discovered they had purchased worthless paper from companies that would never pay a dividend. This created an opportunity for a banker who could serve as an honest intermediary. If Morgan personally investigated a railroad, verified its finances, and vouched for its management, British investors would pay him handsomely for that assurance. His reputation became his stock in trade. Every successful investment he arranged enhanced that reputation. Every fraudulent company he steered investors away from demonstrated his judgment. Morgan developed a process. When a railroad needed financing, Morgan would study its books, travel the line personally to inspect its physical condition, interview its managers, and evaluate its competitive position. He would ask hard questions. Was the line actually built? Were the revenues real? Did the management have the competence to operate profitably? Only if he was satisfied would he agree to arrange financing, and when he did, he insisted on terms that protected investors. Often this meant taking control. Morgan would require a seat on the board of directors. He would insist that his appointees hold key executive positions. He would demand regular financial reports and veto power over major decisions. Railroads that wanted Morgan's backing had to accept Morgan's oversight. For executives accustomed to running their companies as personal fiefdoms, this was infuriating. But they needed the capital, and Morgan had access to it, so they agreed to his terms. Throughout the 1870s, Morgan arranged financing for railroad after railroad: the Albany and Susquehanna, the New York Central, the Pennsylvania. Each successful deal enhanced his reputation and brought him into contact with the titans of American industry: Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, William Vanderbilt. These were the men who were building industrial America, and Morgan was becoming indispensable to their plans. But success brought its own pressures. Morgan worked constantly. He kept brutal hours, arriving at his office before his clerks and often staying long after they left. He read reports, studied balance sheets, calculated risks. His mind never seemed to rest. Associates who met with him were struck by the intensity of his focus. When Morgan listened to a proposal, he gave it his complete attention, asking penetrating questions that revealed whether the presenter truly understood what he was proposing. This intensity took a toll. Morgan began to suffer from nervous exhaustion, a Victorian term for what we might now call stress and anxiety. He had terrible headaches. He slept poorly, his digestion was poor, and his skin condition, the acne rosacea that had plagued him since childhood, worsened dramatically. By his 40s, his nose had become grotesquely enlarged and discoloured, a purple bulbous mass that dominated his face. Photographs from this period show him turning his head to minimise the deformity's visibility. He tried various treatments. He consulted doctors in New York, London, and on the continent. None could help. The condition was incurable. He learned to live with it, but it remained a source of private anguish. Children pointed at him on the street. Strangers stared. Even in photographs which he usually controlled carefully, the disfigurement was obvious and shocking. Perhaps this explains part of his manner. The imperious attitude, the cold stare that intimidated subordinates, the volcanic temper that could erupt without warning, all of these created a shell of intimidation that kept people from getting too close, from seeing the vulnerability beneath. If you were frightened of J.P. Morgan, you did not notice his nose. You noticed his power. By 1880, Morgan was 43 years old, wealthy but not yet truly rich, respected but not yet dominant. His firm had been reorganized in 1871 as Drexel, Morgan and Company, in partnership with the Philadelphia banking house of Drexel and Company. The combined firm had more capital, more connections, more capacity than Morgan alone could have mustered. He was no longer simply Junius Morgan's son building his own business. He was a senior partner in a major banking house. But the great deals that would make him legendary still lay ahead. The industrial consolidations, the steel trust, the rescue of the treasury, These would come in the next phase of his career. For now, he had laid the foundation. He understood the business, he had the connections, he had the capital, and he had developed the judgment that would allow him to make decisions that others would not dare attempt. The grinding years of apprenticeship were nearly over. The age of Morgan's dominance was about to begin, built on a simple observation that would transform American industry. Competition was wasteful. The answer, Morgan believed, was consolidation. In the 1880s and 1890s, American industries were plagued by what contemporaries called ruinous competition. Too many companies chased too few customers. Price wars erupted constantly. Profits evaporated. Companies expanded capacity during boom times, then faced overcapacity during busts. Resources were wasted on duplicated facilities, on advertising campaigns aimed at stealing competitors' customers, on rate wars that benefited no one except consumers. To Morgan's orderly mind, this was madness. The solution seemed obvious: consolidate competing companies into single large corporations that could rationalize production, eliminate duplication, maintain stable prices, and generate reliable profits. This was not about creating monopolies for their own sake, Morgan would insist. It was about bringing efficiency and stability to inherently chaotic industries. The railroads provided the model. In the 1880s, Morgan became the preeminent railroad reorganizer in America. When railroads failed, as they regularly did during the frequent financial panics, Morgan would step in. He would buy up the defaulted bonds at pennies on the dollar, reorganize the company's capital structure, install new management, often merge the failed line with a stronger competitor, and emerge with a profitable, well-managed railroad. The process became known as Morganization. The key to Morganization was control. When Morgan reorganized a railroad, he did not simply arrange financing and walk away. He took seats on the board of directors for himself and his partners. He insisted on voting trust that gave him authority to make major decisions even if he did not own a majority of stock. He required that the railroad's future financing be handled exclusively through J.P. Morgan and Company. In exchange for his capital and expertise, Morgan demanded power. By the 1890s, Morgan and his allies controlled or heavily influenced most of the major railroad systems in America: the New York Central, the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Southern Railway, the Northern Pacific. When these railroads needed to coordinate schedules, set rates, or divide territory, Morgan would summon their presidents to his office or his library and broker agreements. He was, in effect, the regulator of American railroads, performing functions that would later be assumed by government agencies. But railroads were just the beginning. Morgan's most ambitious consolidation came in steel. In 1900, the American steel industry was dominated by a single titanic figure, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie Steel Company was the most efficient steel producer in the world, operating massive integrated mills in Pittsburgh that controlled every stage of production, from iron ore to finished steel products. Carnegie had built his fortune on relentless cost-cutting, driving his workers harder, extracting more production from his facilities, underselling every competitor. He was 74 years old and had begun to talk about retiring, about selling his company, and devoting his remaining years to philanthropy. Morgan saw an opportunity. If he could acquire Carnegie Steel and merge it with a dozen other steel companies, he could create a trust that would dominate American steel production, eliminate the wasteful competition that plagued the industry, and generate enormous profits for its owners. The negotiations took place in early 1901. Charles Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel, met with Morgan to discuss the possibility. Schwab described a vision of a fully integrated steel company that would control every stage of production. Ore mines, railroads to transport the ore, blast furnaces, rolling mills, finishing plants. The efficiencies of such integration would be enormous. The company could set stable prices, plan production rationally, and dominate the industry. Morgan was interested. The question was price. Carnegie's company was privately held, worth perhaps $400 million based on recent earnings. But Carnegie was in a position to drive a hard bargain. He knew Morgan needed his mills to make the consolidation work. The story of the final negotiation has become legendary, though details vary in different accounts. Schwab supposedly met with Carnegie at the old man's mansion and asked him to write down the price he would accept. Carnegie took a pencil, wrote a figure on a piece of paper, and handed it to Schwab. $480 million. Schwab brought the paper to Morgan, who glanced at it and said simply, "I accept." It was the largest business transaction in history to that point. Carnegie walked away with nearly $500 million, making him the richest man in the world. Morgan took Carnegie Steel and merged it with Federal Steel, National Tube, American Steel and Wire, and a half dozen other companies to create United States Steel Corporation. The new company was capitalized at $1.4 billion, making it the world's first billion-dollar corporation. The creation of US Steel in 1901 marked the apex of Morgan's industrial power. He had taken an industry characterized by brutal competition and replaced it with ordered consolidation. US Steel controlled approximately 60% of American steel production. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Its bond issues and stock were held by investors around the world. And at its creation stood J.P. Morgan, the organizer, the financier, the man who had made it happen. But the deal also revealed Morgan's methods and the concerns they raised. US Steel was capitalized at $1.4 billion, but the actual physical assets of the merged companies were worth perhaps $700 million. The difference, $700 million in water, in the parlance of the time, represented anticipated future earnings, the value of eliminating competition, the fees that Morgan and his syndicate charged for organizing the trust. Critics called it a swindle. Morgan called it the value of organization itself. The public reaction was mixed. Some celebrated the creation of a corporation that could compete globally, that brought American efficiency to the steel industry, that provided stable employment for hundreds of thousands. Others saw a monopoly that would abuse its market power, charge excessive prices, crush smaller competitors, and concentrate wealth in the hands of a few financiers. Both views contained truth. President Theodore Roosevelt, who'd taken office in September 1901 after McKinley's assassination, watched Morgan's consolidations with growing concern. Roosevelt was not opposed to big business as such, but he believed that corporations of US Steel's size and power needed to be regulated, to be held accountable to the public interest. The stage was set for a confrontation between private financial power and government authority, a confrontation that would define the progressive era. The collision came in 1902, over railroads rather than steel. Morgan had organized the Northern Securities Company, a holding company that effectively merged the Northern Pacific, Great Northern and Chicago, Burlington and Quincy railroads into a single system, controlling transportation across the northern tier of the United States. It was classic Morganization. Competing railroads consolidated under unified management to eliminate wasteful rate wars and create stable, profitable operations. Roosevelt's Attorney General announced in February 1902 that the federal government would file suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act to dissolve Northern Securities. The suit claimed the company violated federal law against combinations in restraint of trade. It was the first major antitrust action of Roosevelt's administration, and it sent shockwaves through the financial community. Morgan was stunned and furious. According to the famous account, Morgan immediately took a train to Washington to meet with Roosevelt. The conversation that followed revealed the gulf between Morgan's worldview and the new reality of government regulation. Morgan allegedly said to Roosevelt, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." He was proposing that the dispute be settled the way business disputes were settled, through private negotiation between principals. Roosevelt's response was blunt: "That can't be done." The president explained that the government was not interested in a private settlement. This was a matter of law and public policy. The courts would decide whether Northern Securities violated the Sherman Act. Morgan's private power could not simply negotiate its way around federal statutes. Morgan was genuinely puzzled. He asked Roosevelt point blank whether the government intended to attack other trusts he had organized. Roosevelt said he would attack only those engaged in wrongdoing, those whose actions harmed the public interest. But who decided what constituted wrongdoing? In Morgan's world, the market decided. Efficient consolidations survived, wasteful ones failed. The idea that government bureaucrats and judges would make these determinations seemed absurd to him. The case wound through the courts for 2 years. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Northern Securities did indeed violate the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it dissolved. Morgan had lost. Federal authority had trumped private financial power. The precedent was established. Even the most powerful banker in America was subject to federal law. The relationship between Morgan and Roosevelt remained complex. Neither man liked the other personally. Roosevelt thought Morgan represented everything dangerous about concentrated wealth: arrogance, contempt for democratic accountability, the assumption that financial power should be unregulated. Morgan thought Roosevelt was a demagogue pandering to populist resentment, a man who did not understand business attacking the very engines of American prosperity. Yet they needed each other. Roosevelt needed Morgan's cooperation to prevent financial panics and maintain economic stability. Morgan needed Roosevelt's political protection against more radical reformers who wanted to break up all large corporations. They maintained a wary, mutually useful relationship, each mistrusting the other but recognizing necessity. The Panic of 1907 would test that relationship and demonstrate both the power Morgan still wielded and the limits that were increasingly constraining it. When the crisis came, it would be Morgan, not Roosevelt, who saved the American economy. But the rescue would also prove that relying on a single private banker to stabilize the financial system was too dangerous to continue. The age of Morgan's kind of personal power was ending, even as he exercised it for the last time. At the peak of his power, J.P. Morgan's daily routine revealed the man behind the legend. Not the ogre of newspaper cartoons or the saviour of capitalism his admirers portrayed, but something more complex and more human. Understanding how Morgan actually lived hour by hour, day by day, helps explain both his achievements and his limitations. Morgan rose early, typically around 7 o'clock. His house at 219 Madison Avenue, a brownstone mansion in Murray Hill, was substantial but not ostentatious by the standards of America's wealthiest families. The Vanderbilts built French chateaux. The Astors created palaces. Morgan lived in refined comfort but without the aggressive display that characterized newer money. His house reflected old New York values: quality, substance, tradition. His morning routine began with breakfast, substantial and hearty. Morgan was a large man, well over 6 feet tall and heavy-set, with appetites to match. He believed in eating well. Steak and eggs, toast, coffee. This was fuel for the day ahead. He read the newspapers while he ate, studying financial news with particular care. The markets, the business section, reports of railroad earnings, news of European economic conditions. All of this he absorbed and filed away, building the mental map of information he would draw on throughout the day. By 8:30, Morgan was ready to leave for his office. He walked when weather permitted, striding down Madison Avenue to the financial district. The walk took perhaps 45 minutes, and Morgan used it to think, to process information, to prepare for the day's decisions. Those who saw him on these morning walks reported that he appeared formidable, a large man with a stern expression, dressed always in impeccably tailored dark suits, walking with a gold-headed cane that was more prop than necessity. His office was at 23 Wall Street, the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a corner structure with no particular architectural distinction. Morgan had purchased the site in 1873 and built a 4-story building that communicated solidity and permanence. Later the building would become famous as the Corner, the most powerful address in American finance. Inside, the offices were arranged to reflect the firm's hierarchy. Junior partners and clerks worked in the outer rooms. Morgan's private office occupied the corner, with windows looking out on both Wall Street and Broad Street. The office was not large, but it was furnished with understated elegance, dark wood panelling, a massive desk, leather chairs, and paintings from Morgan's art collection on the walls. Morgan arrived at his desk around 9:30 and immediately began the day's work. There was correspondence to read, reports from the firm's various departments, requests for meetings, proposals for deals. He read quickly, absorbing information, making marginal notes, dictating responses to his secretaries. His handwriting was surprisingly delicate for such a large man, flowing and elegant. Throughout the morning, partners and associates would come to his office seeking decisions. Should the firm participate in a particular bond issue? Was a certain railroad creditworthy? Should they extend credit to a business seeking commercial loans? Morgan listened, asked questions, and decided. His decisions were quick and final. He did not second-guess himself or invite debate once he had made up his mind. Partners who worked with him learned to present their cases succinctly. Morgan had no patience for unnecessary detail or rambling explanations. Present the facts, state your recommendation, answer his questions. If you could do that coherently in 5 minutes, he would listen. If you took 15 minutes to say what could be said in 5, he would cut you off. Time was too valuable to waste on poor organization. The famous Morgan stare was real. When he focused his full attention on someone, the effect was unnerving. His eyes, described by various observers as piercing, penetrating, or hypnotic, seemed to look, through pretense, straight to the truth. Men who had faced hostile crowds, survived business crises, or built empires reported feeling intimidated when Morgan fixed them with that stare. Part of it was physical, the intensity of his gaze. Part of it was psychological, the knowledge that this man controlled access to capital that could make or break your enterprise. Lunch was a brief affair, often taken at one of the nearby restaurants that catered to the financial district. Morgan preferred simple food and good wine. He was not a gourmet, but he appreciated quality. He often lunched with other bankers or business associates, turning the meal into an extension of business. Deals were discussed over oysters and roast beef. Alliances were formed over Bordeaux. The informal conversations of lunchtime sometimes accomplished more than formal meetings. Afternoons brought more meetings, more decisions, more work. But by 3 o'clock or so, when the stock market closed, Morgan's attention would often turn to his other passion, art. He was building one of the greatest private art collections in America, rivaling those of European aristocrats and American millionaires. Dealers would bring him pieces to examine. He would study catalogues of upcoming auctions. He corresponded with agents in Europe who alerted him to treasures becoming available. Morgan's approach to collecting revealed the same qualities he brought to finance. He did not simply buy what pleased him aesthetically. He studied art history, he consulted experts, he built systematic collections in particular areas: medieval manuscripts, Renaissance paintings, ancient Egyptian artifacts, rare books. His collection was not simply an accumulation of expensive objects. It was a coherent, thoughtfully constructed assemblage that documented the development of human artistic achievement. He could be as ruthless in art acquisition as in business. When he wanted a piece, he usually got it, outbidding competitors, pressuring dealers, using his wealth and connections to access works that others could not reach. His collection eventually included works by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Vermeer. He owned manuscripts illuminated by medieval monks. He had sculptures from ancient Rome. His library of rare books was unsurpassed, but there was something touching in his passion for these objects. Here was a man who in business was cold, calculating, and focused entirely on profit. In art he revealed a different side: appreciation for beauty, respect for human creativity, a desire to possess and preserve things that transcended mere commercial value. The art collection was perhaps the one area of his life where Morgan allowed himself to be vulnerable to beauty. By 5 or 6 in the evening, Morgan would leave his office. If he had no social engagement, he would return home for dinner with his wife Fanny, and whichever of his children still lived at home. Dinner was formal but not elaborate. The family maintained standards. They dressed for dinner. Conversation was civilized, but Morgan was not a warm or demonstrative father. He provided for his children generously, ensured they received excellent educations, and expected them to uphold the family name. Emotional intimacy was not his strength. After dinner, he often retired to his library, a magnificent room that eventually housed his art collection and rare books. Here he would smoke cigars, enormous black cigars that he went through by the dozen. The cigars were his one obvious vice, and he indulged it without restraint. He would read, examine his art objects, or simply sit and think. These evening hours in the library were perhaps his only time of true relaxation. He slept in a separate bedroom from his wife, a common arrangement among wealthy couples of the era. His bedroom was austere, almost monastic. A large bed, simple furniture, none of the art that filled the rest of the house. He needed darkness and quiet to sleep. Even so, he often slept poorly, his mind continuing to work through financial problems even in rest. Morgan's relationship with his wife Fanny was formal and distant. She managed his household competently, maintained his social calendar, and raised their children. But there was little warmth between them. Morgan sought physical and emotional connection elsewhere, in a series of discreet relationships with other women. He was careful about these affairs. Scandal could damage his reputation, and reputation was the foundation of his business. But he made no secret among his intimate circle that his marriage was a partnership of convenience rather than passion. Weekends and vacations offered respite from the constant pressure. Morgan had a country estate, Cragston, on the Hudson River. He also bought a large steam yacht, which he named Corsair. The yacht became his sanctuary, a floating palace where he could escape the demands of business and the public eye. He would cruise along the Atlantic coast or through European waters, entertaining guests, collecting art at ports of call, and giving his nervous system a chance to recover from the relentless stress of finance. But even on vacation, he never entirely escaped work. Partners would send telegrams requiring decisions. Business crises would erupt that demanded his attention. He would cut short vacations to rush back to New York when situations required his presence. His life was his work, and no amount of leisure could fully separate him from it. Morgan's personality was a study in contradictions. In business, he was decisive. even reckless in his willingness to commit enormous sums based on his judgment. In personal life, he was cautious and conventional, uncomfortable with emotional expression. He could be extraordinarily generous, giving millions to charities, churches, and institutions. He could also be petty and vindictive, nursing grudges against those who had crossed him. His temper was legendary. When angered, Morgan could explode with volcanic fury. Associates learned to recognize the warning signs: the tightening of his jaw, the reddening of his face, the sudden stillness before the storm. When Morgan lost his temper, grown men quailed. He would shout, pound his desk, use profanity that would have shocked his mother. Then, minutes later, the storm would pass and he would resume business as if nothing had happened. His skin condition remained a constant source of self-consciousness. He avoided being photographed when possible. When photography was necessary, he insisted on careful lighting and specific angles that minimized the appearance of his nose. He could not control this one aspect of his appearance, this one visible sign of vulnerability, and it tormented him. Yet somehow he had transformed this vulnerability into a kind of armor. The disfigurement made him so self-conscious that he developed an intimidating presence to compensate. The result was a man whose physical appearance initially shocked people, but whose force of personality quickly dominated their attention. You noticed the nose first, then you noticed the power, and the nose became irrelevant. Morgan's close relationships revealed dimensions of his personality that few outsiders saw. His friendship with Bishop William Lawrence of Massachusetts showed a side of Morgan that contradicted his public image as a ruthless financier. Lawrence and Morgan discussed theology, philosophy, the proper use of wealth. Morgan supported the Episcopal Church generously, not as cynical public relations, but from genuine if conventional piety. He believed in a God who had ordered the universe and placed men in their proper stations. His wealth was a trust to be managed responsibly. His relationship with Belle de Costa Green, the librarian he hired to manage his art collection, hinted at emotional depths he rarely revealed. Green was a young African-American woman passing for white, brilliant and cultured, who understood Morgan's passion for rare books and manuscripts. Some historians have speculated that their relationship went beyond professional collaboration, that Green became one of Morgan's intimate companions. If so, it remained discreet. What is certain is that Morgan trusted her judgment about art and valued her company in ways he did not with most people. His yacht, the Corsair, became increasingly important as Morgan aged. The vessel was his sanctuary, the one place where he could escape the constant demands of business and public scrutiny. He would cruise the Atlantic coast or Mediterranean for weeks at a time, collecting art at various ports, entertaining select guests, and allowing his strained nervous system to recover. The yacht's library was as fine as many established institutions. The dining salon could seat a dozen comfortably. The staterooms were appointed with luxury that rivaled the best hotels. But even on the Corsair, business intruded. During the panic of 1907, when Morgan was cruising off the Virginia coast, he received telegrams reporting the developing crisis. He immediately ordered the yacht to return to New York, racing back to take command of the financial rescue. The sanctuary was never quite complete. His responsibilities followed him even onto the water. By his 60s, Morgan had developed the routine and habits that would carry him to the end of his life. He knew what worked for him. He had found ways to manage the stress, to maintain his health despite the punishing demands of his work. He was at the peak of his powers, the most influential private citizen in America, perhaps in the world, and the next chapter of his story would see him deploy that power in ways that would fundamentally reshape American capitalism. But first would come the tests, the panics and crises that would reveal whether Morgan's power was real or merely appearance. The age of Morgan's greatest achievements was beginning, built on decades of careful preparation and accumulated authority that no one could quite explain but everyone could feel. The panic of 1907 revealed J.P. Morgan at the height of his powers. In a few weeks of crisis that shook American finance to its foundations, Morgan demonstrated that he possessed more practical authority than the federal government itself. What happened during those frantic autumn days would shape American banking for the next century and cement Morgan's reputation as the most powerful financier in history. The panic began, as financial panics often do, with a failed speculation. In October 1907, two speculators, Augustus Heinze and Charles Morse, attempted to corner the market in copper stock. Their scheme required enormous borrowed capital, and when it failed, the banks and trust companies that had lent them money faced catastrophic losses. Depositors, hearing rumours of these losses, rushed to withdraw their money. The banks could not meet the sudden demand for cash. They closed their doors. The panic spread. Within days, perfectly sound institutions were facing runs. Trust companies, which operated like banks but with less regulation, were particularly vulnerable. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's largest and most respected, was besieged by depositors demanding their money. The trust's reserves were depleted. It closed on October 22nd, triggering even wider panic. The stock market collapsed. Businesses that depended on short-term credit found they could not borrow. Trade ground to a halt. The entire American economy teetered on the edge of complete breakdown, and the federal government, which would later respond to such crises with massive intervention, stood by helplessly. The Treasury had limited funds and no mechanism for intervening in private markets. President Theodore Roosevelt, that robust champion of federal power in so many areas, was effectively irrelevant. It was Morgan, not the government, who took charge. At 70 years old, he became the de facto central banker of the United States. The crisis came to a head in the first week of November. Morgan gathered the presidents of New York's major banks and trust companies at his library at 36 East 36th Street. The library was Morgan's private sanctuary, a magnificent building designed by McKim, Mead and White, filled with his art collection and rare books. Now it became the command centre for saving American finance. Morgan set up operations in the West Room. Bankers and trust company presidents were summoned, arriving throughout the day and evening. They waited in the East Room, smoking, pacing, waiting to be called into Morgan's presence. Inside the West Room, Morgan received them one by one, examined their books, evaluated their solvency, and decided which institutions would receive support and which would be allowed to fail. The decisions were entirely his. Morgan had no legal authority to do what he was doing. He held no government office, but he controlled access to capital, and in a liquidity crisis, access to capital meant survival. Banks that Morgan deemed sound received loans from a pool of funds he had organised. Banks he judged insolvent were left to their fate. On the night of November 2nd, the crisis reached its peak. The New York Stock Exchange itself was about to collapse. The exchange needed $25 million immediately, or it would have to close, which would trigger total financial collapse. Morgan personally arranged the loan, calling on the banks he had just rescued to provide the funds. They complied. The exchange remained open. But the most dramatic moment came later that same night. By 10 o'clock, Morgan had decided that a group of trust company presidents who had been waiting in his library needed to commit to a rescue plan. They were reluctant, nervous about risking their own institutions to save others. Morgan was done negotiating. He locked the doors of the library, trapping the bankers inside, and informed them they were not leaving until they agreed to his plan. For hours, the trust company presidents argued and negotiated, tried to find ways out of the commitment Morgan demanded. Morgan sat in the West Room playing solitaire, a game he played constantly when thinking through problems. Occasionally he would call someone in to address a specific concern, but mostly he waited, letting the pressure build. At 4:30 in the morning, Morgan's lawyer emerged with the agreement he had drafted. Morgan took it to the East Room where the exhausted trust company presidents were still debating. He placed the document on a table, handed his fountain pen to the president of the Trust Company of America, and said simply, "There's the place, King, and here's the pen." His tone left no room for refusal. King signed. The others followed. The trust companies would support each other. The panic would be contained. American finance was saved. When the crisis was finally over, a few weeks later, the public reaction was mixed. Some praised Morgan as the hero who had prevented economic catastrophe. President Roosevelt publicly thanked him, but others were horrified. One man, they realized, had wielded more power over the American economy than the elected government. During the crucial days of the panic, Morgan's decisions had determined which financial institutions lived and which died, which businesses received credit and which did not. He had effectively functioned as a central bank, but he was responsible to no one except himself. This was the paradox of Pierpont Morgan. He had saved American capitalism, but in doing so he had revealed how fragile it was, how dependent on the decisions of a single private citizen. The nation's financial system should not require a 70-year-old banker working through the night in his private library. There needed to be an institutional response to financial panics, a central bank that could provide liquidity in emergencies. The panic of 1907 led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Morgan had demonstrated both the need for a central bank and the danger of leaving such power in private hands. His rescue had been brilliant, decisive, and ultimately successful. But it would be the last time a private banker would exercise such authority. The age of Morgan's kind of personal financial power was ending, though Morgan himself didn't yet understand that. In the aftermath of the panic, Morgan was exhausted. The crisis had required weeks of 18-hour days, constant decision-making under enormous pressure, the stress of knowing that his choices affected millions of people who would never know his name. He took an extended trip to Europe to recover, travelling through Italy and Egypt, examining art and antiquities, trying to restore his depleted energy. But his health never fully recovered from the strain. The panic of 1907 had demonstrated the height of Morgan's power. It had also marked the beginning of his physical decline. By 1910, J.P. Morgan's power had made him a target. Progressive reformers, muckraking journalists, and ambitious politicians saw in Morgan the personification of everything wrong with American capitalism. He was the money trust, the hidden hand that controlled the economy, the plutocrat who wielded power without accountability. The attacks would culminate in a congressional investigation that would transform Morgan from financial titan into political scapegoat. The assault began in the press. In 1910, Life magazine, then a humour magazine rather than the photojournal it would later become, published a cover showing Morgan's face in the middle of a spider web, with threads connecting to banks, railroads, and industrial corporations. The image captured perfectly what many Americans had come to believe, that Morgan sat at the centre of a vast web of interlocking corporate control, manipulating the economy for his private benefit. Louis Brandeis, the progressive lawyer who would later become a Supreme Court justice, wrote a series of articles titled "Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It," directly attacking Morgan and his fellow financiers. Brandeis argued that a small group of bankers through interlocking directorates and control of credit, had created a money trust that stifled competition, dictated terms to industrial corporations, and extracted wealth without creating value. The charges were not entirely unfair. Morgan did sit on the boards of dozens of major corporations. His partners sat on dozens more. When a company needed financing, it came to Morgan. When Morgan provided that financing, he often required representation on the board. Over decades, this had created a network of connections that linked banks to railroads, to steel companies to insurance firms. Was this coordination and stability, as Morgan argued? Or was it monopoly and manipulation, as his critics claimed? In 1912, Congress established the Peugeot Committee, named after its chairman, Representative Arsène Peugeot of Louisiana, to investigate the concentration of financial power. The committee was staffed by progressive reformers determined to expose the money trust. The chief investigator was Samuel Untermeyer, a lawyer with a gift for publicity and a determination to humble the mighty. In December 1912, Morgan was summoned to testify. He was 75 years old, his health failing, his energy depleted. But there was no question of refusing. The summons came from Congress, and even J.P. Morgan had to answer. The testimony took place over 2 days in the Peugeot Committee hearing room. The chamber was packed with journalists, reformers, and curious onlookers who had come to see the great financier interrogated. Morgan arrived each morning in his usual formal attire, accompanied by lawyers, and took his seat at the witness table facing the committee. Untermeyer conducted the questioning, and he was relentless. He asked Morgan about interlocking directorates, about control of credit, about whether Morgan and a few other bankers effectively controlled the American economy. Morgan defended himself with the arguments he had used his entire life. He provided capital to sound enterprises. He charged fair rates for his services. He operated in the public interest. The exchange grew heated. Untermeyer pressed Morgan to admit that he controlled vast amounts of capital. Morgan insisted that control was not the same as ownership, that he operated with other people's money but did not personally command it. Untermeyer asked about specific deals, specific companies. Morgan's memory, never perfect for details, seemed to fail him repeatedly. He could not recall exact figures. He confused dates. His lawyers intervened to protect him. But there was one exchange that captured something essential about Morgan's worldview, and the gulf between him and his progressive critics. Untermeyer asked Morgan whether commercial credit was based primarily on money or property. Morgan replied that neither was most important. The first thing is character, he said, before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it. The statement revealed Morgan's fundamental philosophy. He believed that finance, at its core, was built on personal relationships and reputation. He lent money to people he trusted, to men whose character he had evaluated. All the balance sheets and collateral in the world meant nothing if you could not trust the borrower to honour his obligations. This was the old way of banking, personal and subjective, built on handshake deals between men who knew each other. Untermeyer and the progressives saw this differently. Character-based lending meant arbitrary power. It meant Morgan and his circle decided who received credit and who did not, based on their personal judgment. It excluded outsiders, newcomers, anyone who did not belong to the club. The reformers wanted impersonal rules, transparent procedures, democratic access to capital. Morgan wanted what he had always had, personal discretion. The hearings dragged on for weeks. Morgan testified, his partners testified, other bankers were called. The committee collected thousands of pages of documents and testimony. When it finally issued its report in 1913, the conclusion was damning. The committee found that a small group of bankers, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, exercised concentrated control over American finance, through interlocking directorates, control of credit, and influence over corporations. The report recommended legislative action to break up this concentration of power. It proposed restrictions on interlocking directorates, limits on the size of financial institutions, and creation of a central bank that would assume the functions Morgan had performed privately during the Panic of 1907. For Morgan, the hearings were a humiliation. He had spent his career building his reputation, cultivating an image as a responsible steward of capital, a man who acted in the public interest even while making profits. Now he was being portrayed as an oligarch, a plutocrat, a threat to democracy. Editorial cartoons showed him as a bloated capitalist squeezing the people. Progressive candidates campaigned against the money trust and mentioned Morgan by name. More painful than the political attacks was the personal toll. Morgan was exhausted by the testimony, the stress, the hostile questioning, the need to defend himself publicly. All of this wore him down. His health, already fragile, deteriorated further. He developed bronchitis that would not clear. He lost weight. His energy flagged. In February 1913, just weeks after the Peugeot hearings concluded, Morgan left New York for what he hoped would be a restorative trip to Europe. He travelled to Egypt first, examining antiquities along the Nile. Then he continued to Rome, the city he loved, to see the art he had collected throughout his life. He checked into the Grand Hotel, engaged a suite with a view, and tried to rest. But he could not recover. The bronchitis worsened into pneumonia. His heart, strained by decades of stress and a lifetime of rich food and cigars, began to fail. By mid-March, it was clear he was dying. His son Jack was summoned from New York, but the Atlantic crossing took days. By the time Jack reached Rome, his father was barely conscious. On March 31st, 1913, in the suite at the Grand Hotel, J.P. Morgan died. The wealthiest, most powerful private banker in American history was gone, felled ultimately not by business rivals or political enemies, but by the simple failure of a human body that could not sustain the burdens he had placed upon it. J.P. Morgan's body was returned to New York on his yacht, the Corsair, which his son had sailed to Naples to receive the coffin. The ship made the Atlantic crossing in April, arriving in New York Harbor where it was met by a flotilla of vessels, flags at half-mast. The body lay in state at the Madison Avenue mansion while thousands of New Yorkers filed past to pay respects. The funeral service took place at St. George's Episcopal Church, the Morgan family church where J.P. had worshipped for decades when he was in New York. The church was packed with mourners representing every sector of American society. Bankers and businessmen, certainly, but also artists, scholars, church officials, and ordinary citizens who felt they owed something to the man who had, in their view, saved American capitalism from itself during the Panic of 1907. The eulogies praised Morgan's achievements and his character. They spoke of his business acumen, his patronage of the arts, his support for churches and charitable institutions. They noted his personal force, the quality of presence that had allowed him to dominate every room he entered. They did not dwell on the controversies, the Peugeot committee hearings, the charges of monopoly power. Death had a way of simplifying legacies, and in the immediate aftermath of Morgan's passing, there was a widespread sense that America had lost someone irreplaceable. Morgan was buried at Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut, returning in death to the city of his birth. The grave was marked with a simple stone, modest by the standards of Gilded Age funeral monuments. No elaborate mausoleum, no sculptural allegory, just his name, his dates, and the understated dignity that old New York families affected. The reading of the will produced a surprise. The public had assumed Morgan was the richest man in America, worth hundreds of millions. But when his estate was valued, It totaled approximately $68 million in liquid assets, plus art collections valued at another $50 million or so. This was enormous wealth by the standards of the time, enough to keep his descendants comfortable for generations, but it was far less than the fortunes of Rockefeller or Carnegie, men who had built industrial empires while Morgan arranged their financing. The explanation was that Morgan had never accumulated wealth for its own sake. He had spent lavishly on art, on his yacht, on maintaining multiple residences and a lifestyle of refined luxury. More significantly, he had repeatedly used his own capital to bail out the firms and institutions he controlled. During financial panics, when banks and companies needed emergency funds, Morgan had often provided them from his personal fortune. He had saved other people's money more assiduously than his own. John D. Rockefeller, when he heard the size of Morgan's estate, reportedly said, "And to think he wasn't even a rich man." The comment, whether apocryphal or real, captured an essential truth. Morgan's power had never been primarily about personal wealth. It had been about access to capital, about reputation, about the ability to mobilize other people's money for purposes he deemed important. His true legacy was not in his personal fortune, but in the institutions he had built and the precedents he had set. The firm J.P. Morgan and Company continued under the leadership of his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack. The younger Morgan lacked his father's force of personality and his instinctive judgment, but he was competent and careful. Under Jack's leadership, the firm navigated the creation of the Federal Reserve System, financed the Allied cause during World War I, and remained one of the most prestigious banking houses in the world. But the age of the individual banking titan was ending. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, passed just months after Morgan's death, created the institutional central banking system that America had lacked during the Panic of 1907. No longer would the nation's financial stability depend on a single banker working through the night in his private library. The government now had tools to intervene during crises, to provide liquidity, to regulate the banking system. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, passed in response to the Great Depression, forced commercial banks to separate from investment banks. J.P. Morgan and Company had to choose. It could take deposits and make loans, or it could underwrite securities and advise corporations, but not both. The firm chose to remain a commercial bank, spinning off its investment banking operations into a new firm, Morgan Stanley. These regulatory changes fundamentally altered the landscape of American finance. The concentration of power that Morgan had represented became illegal. No single institution could dominate multiple sectors of finance. No individual banker could exercise the personal authority that Morgan had wielded. Power was diffused, regulated, subject to government oversight. Yet Morgan's influence persisted in subtler ways. The model of relationship banking that he pioneered, where banks took long-term stakes in corporations and provided ongoing strategic advice, became standard practice. The idea that banks had responsibilities beyond simple profit, maximization, that they should act as stewards of capital rather than mere intermediaries, this Morganian concept shaped banking culture for generations. The transformation of American finance after Morgan's death followed two parallel tracks: institutionalization and regulation. The Federal Reserve System, created in 1913 largely in response to the lessons of the 1907 panic, represented the institutionalization of the central banking function Morgan had performed personally. Instead of J.P. Morgan deciding which banks would receive emergency loans during a crisis, the Federal Reserve could provide liquidity systematically. Instead of Morgan gathering bankers in his library and commanding them to support failing institutions, the Fed could orchestrate rescues through established procedures. But the Fed's creation also revealed ambivalence about concentrated financial power. The The system was deliberately decentralized, with 12 regional Federal Reserve banks rather than a single, central institution. This reflected American suspicion of concentrated power, the fear that had animated opposition to Morgan himself. The United States finally had a central bank, but one designed to diffuse power rather than concentrate it. The regulatory track intensified during the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and the banking system collapsed in the early 1930s, reformers blamed the kind of concentrated financial power Morgan had represented. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forced the separation of commercial and investment banking, directly attacking the business model of firms like J.P. Morgan and Company that had combined both functions. Securities regulation, enforced by the newly created Securities and Exchange Commission, brought government oversight to financial markets that had operated with minimal supervision during Morgan's era. The irony was that Morgan's own practices had generally been more conservative than what came after him. He had insisted on careful evaluation of securities before selling them to investors. He had demanded real assets backing corporate bonds. He had refused to participate in the wildest speculation of the 1920s. Yet his firm suffered from the backlash against financial excess he had largely avoided. J.P. Morgan and Company chose to remain a commercial bank under Glass-Steagall, maintaining its traditional business of taking deposits and making loans. The investment banking operations were spun off into Morgan Stanley, named for two Morgan partners. The split that reformers had demanded created two firms, both prestigious, both carrying the Morgan name, both adhering to the high standards of conservative banking that the original Morgan had insisted upon. The art collection that had been Morgan's consuming passion became one of his most enduring legacies. His son Jack, understanding that the vast collection could not be kept together privately, made gifts to major museums. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York received thousands of objects: European paintings, ancient sculptures, decorative arts, medieval armour. The Morgan Library, the building at 36th Street where Morgan had saved American finance during the Panic of 1907, became a public institution. The Pierpont Morgan Library, as it was formerly known, opened to scholars and eventually to the general public. It housed Morgan's collection of rare books, illuminated manuscripts, early printed works, and drawings by old masters. Visitors could walk through the West Room where Morgan had made decisions affecting millions of lives, could see the paintings that had hung on his walls, could examine the manuscripts he'd collected. The private sanctuary of America's most powerful banker became a monument to cultural preservation. Today, the Morgan Library and Museum stands as one of New York's finest cultural institutions. Scholars travel from around the world to examine its holdings. Exhibitions display treasures from its collection. The building itself, with its magnificent Renaissance-style architecture and beautifully preserved interiors, offers a glimpse into the world of Gilded Age wealth and cultivation. Morgan the financier is largely forgotten by the general public. Morgan the collector lives on through an institution that bears his name. The industrial consolidations that Morgan orchestrated proved more problematic over time. U.S. Steel, the trust he created by merging Carnegie Steel with a dozen competitors, dominated American steel production for decades. At its peak in the 1940s during World War II, U.S. Steel produced over 1/3 of America's steel, the material that built ships, tanks, and bridges. The efficient integrated operations that Morgan had envisioned functioned exactly as planned during the emergency of global war. But the monopoly that seemed so beneficial in 1901 became a source of inefficiency by mid-century. Protected from effective competition, U.S. Steel grew complacent. It underinvested in new technology while foreign competitors, particularly Japanese and German firms rebuilding after World War II, adopted more efficient production methods. The company maintained outdated plants, preserved inefficient work rules, negotiated with powerful unions, and gradually lost market share. By the 1980s, US steel was a shadow of its former dominance, and American steel production had been overtaken by foreign competitors. The pattern repeated across industries Morgan had consolidated. The efficiencies of consolidation were real in the short term, eliminating wasteful duplication and stabilizing competition. But over decades, the lack of competitive pressure led to stagnation. The organizational stability Morgan prized became organizational rigidity. The structures Morgan built lasted, but they did not adapt. The railroads he reorganized and Morganized followed a similar trajectory. The eliminer of ruinous competition through consolidation allowed railroads to plan rationally, invest in improvements, and provide reliable service. But the monopolistic practices that consolidation enabled ultimately led to government regulation through the Interstate Commerce Commission, rate controls that limited profitability, and the slow decline of rail transport as trucking and aviation offered alternatives. The vast railroad empires Morgan had assembled were gradually dismantled through bankruptcy, merger, and deregulation over the course of the 20th century. Yet in the realm of ideas and institutional practices, Morgan's influence persisted and even intensified. The concept of relationship banking, where a bank maintains long-term connections with corporate clients and provides strategic advice beyond simple lending, became standard at major financial institutions. Investment banks developed industry expertise, built relationships with management teams, and served as trusted advisors in ways that Morgan had pioneered. The syndicate method of underwriting securities that Morgan had refined became the model for how major capital is raised. When a corporation or government needs to borrow large sums, a group of banks forms a syndicate to share the risk and distribute the securities. The lead bank, like Morgan's firm in earlier times, organizes the syndicate, sets terms, and maintains the relationship with the issuer. This collaborative approach to financing major projects directly descended from Morgan's practices. The activist investor approach, where major shareholders push for changes in corporate management and strategy, also traces back to Morgan's methods. When Morgan reorganized companies, he did not simply provide capital and walk away. He took board seats, installed new management, monitored operations, and forced changes when companies underperformed. Modern private equity firms and activist hedge funds follow a similar playbook, though they rarely acknowledge the 19th century banker as their intellectual ancestor. The question of too big to fail, which became central to financial policy debates after the 2008 crisis, was fundamentally a Morganian question. Should large financial institutions be allowed to fail and face bankruptcy like any other business? Or do some institutions become so large and interconnected that their failure would threaten the entire system? Morgan believed that certain institutions were indeed too important to fail, and he used his personal authority to prevent their collapse during the 1907 panic. The Federal Reserve and modern governments have institutionalized this principle, providing taxpayer backing to systemically important financial institutions. But the 2008 crisis also revealed the limits of the Morganian approach to finance. When Lehman Brothers collapsed and credit markets froze, when insurance giant AIG faced insolvency and threatened to bring down major banks, when the global financial system teetered on the brink, it was the federal government, not private bankers, that intervened with trillions of dollars in bailouts, loans, and guarantees. The scale of the crisis exceeded what private capital could address. Only government, with its power to create money and command resources, possessed the capacity to prevent total collapse. The subsequent debates about financial reform revisited arguments that had raged during Morgan's lifetime. Should large banks be broken up to prevent them from becoming too powerful? Should risky activities like securities trading be separated from basic banking? Should regulators have power to intervene in the operations of financial institutions before crises develop? These were precisely the questions that Morgan's career had raised a century earlier, still unanswered, still contested, still central to understanding how capitalism should function in a democratic society. The Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act of 2010 imposed new regulations on large financial institutions requiring higher capital reserves, stress tests to evaluate resilience, and resolution plans for orderly failure. These measures addressed concerns about concentrated financial power that dated to Morgan's era. Yet the largest banks continued to grow, now truly global institutions with balance sheets larger than the GDP of most countries. JP Morgan Chase, the firm bearing Morgan's name, became the largest bank in the United States, with over $3 trillion in assets and operations in dozens of countries. The current CEO of JP Morgan Chase, like Morgan, wields enormous influence. The bank's decisions about which companies receive credit, which industries to finance, which risks to take, have consequences for millions of people who will never know the CEO's name. But that power is now constrained by regulation, monitored by government agencies, subject to congressional oversight, and limited by laws that Morgan would have found intolerable. The principle of private financial power serving public purposes persists, but the balance between private discretion and public control has shifted decisively toward regulation and accountability. Morgan believed that character was more important than collateral, that finance was fundamentally about human relationships and trust. Modern banking, with its quantitative models, its algorithmic lending decisions, its regulatory compliance requirements, has moved far from that personal vision. Yet in the highest levels of finance, in the relationships between major banks and their most important clients, something of Morgan's model persists. Personal relationships still matter, reputation still counts, trust still underpins the most significant transactions. The scale has changed, the context has changed, but human nature has not. The most profound question Morgan's life raises is about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. In a democratic society, where political power theoretically flows from the people, what role should private economic power play? Morgan exercised authority that was essentially public in its scope and impact, but he was accountable to no one except himself and his firm's partners. He made decisions affecting millions of lives without being elected, without public oversight, without democratic accountability. The progressive reformers who investigated Morgan in the Pujo hearings believed this was intolerable in a democracy. They sought to break up concentrated economic power, to bring it under public control, to ensure that major economic decisions served democratic purposes rather than private interests. Their reforms, from antitrust enforcement to financial regulation to the Federal Reserve System, represented attempts to subordinate private economic power to public authority. Yet the reformers never fully succeeded, and perhaps could not have. Capitalism requires private decision-making about capital allocation. Someone must decide which businesses receive funding and which do not, which projects go forward and which are abandoned. Those decisions cannot be made democratically because they require expertise, speed, and willingness to accept failure. Morgan understood this. His defense of his power always rested on the claim that he made better decisions than government bureaucrats or democratic processes could make. The tension has never been resolved. Modern capitalism still concentrates enormous power in private hands. The CEOs of major corporations and financial institutions still make decisions with vast public consequences. They are now constrained by regulation, subject to oversight, answerable to boards of directors and shareholders. But within those constraints, they exercise discretion that Morgan would recognise. The difference is one of degree and accountability, not of fundamental character. Morgan's shadow stretches across more than a century of financial history. Every debate about bank regulation invokes his legacy. Every financial crisis prompts comparisons to 1907. Every discussion of too big to fail references the power he wielded. He has become a symbol, representing both the potential and the danger of concentrated financial power, the argument for and against allowing private bankers to shape the public economy. As we reach the end of this journey through J.P. Morgan's extraordinary life, we return to where we began, to a hotel room in Rome where the most powerful private banker in history lay dying. But now we understand what that death meant, not just for his family or his firm, but for the nation and the financial system he had done so much to create. Morgan believed that character was more important than collateral, that finance was fundamentally about human relationships and trust. He believed that power came with responsibility, that those who controlled capital had obligations to use it wisely. He believed in consolidation, in organisation, in bringing order to the chaos of industrial competition, and he believed that he personally had the judgment and the right to make decisions that affected millions of lives. These beliefs shaped American capitalism for a generation. They created the industrial structure of the early 20th century. They provided the model, both positive and negative, that reformers reacted against when they built the regulatory state. Morgan's career was the argument for and against concentrated financial power, the proof that such power could be used responsibly, and the demonstration that it should not be trusted to individuals acting in private. In the end, Morgan was neither the saviour his admirers claimed, nor the villain his critics portrayed. He was something more interesting and more human, a man of extraordinary ability and enormous flaws who wielded more power than any private citizen should possess, and who used that power sometimes for the public good and sometimes for his own interests, often unable to distinguish between the two. His art collection beautified museums, his consolidations organised industries, his banking rescues prevented economic catastrophes, but his monopolies also stifled competition. His personal authority undermined democratic accountability. His success demonstrated both the potential and the danger of concentrated wealth. The sunrise filters through the windows of the Grand Hotel in Rome. Morgan's body has been prepared for the journey home. His son Jack has begun the long process of settling the estate and managing the transition of power. In New York, the markets have already adjusted to a world without J.P. Morgan. The system he dominated will continue. The institutions he built will survive. But the age of the individual banking colossus is ending. If you have travelled with me through this remarkable story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Each subscription helps bring more of these journeys into history to life. Tell me in the comments what moment in Morgan's story struck you most deeply. I read every comment and always love hearing your thoughts. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. The financier who held more power than presidents sleeps in Hartford soil. His empire has been transformed and regulated and absorbed into institutions he could not have imagined. But the questions his life raised, about wealth and power and responsibility, remain as urgent today as they were when he made his final journey to Rome in 1913.